We're going to continue a little bit of work on understanding the controls over ecosystem processes and using the state factor approach. Now, to recap, the state factor approach, as Jenny had characterized it for soils, was that soils are a function of 5 different state factors: climate, organisms, relief, parent material, and time. And from this, we can derive a conceptual diagram to use. So we know that it's a function of 5 different factors, but when we draw it out, what is it going to look like? Now, this isn't a place where we're really using pools and fluxes in this sense, but it's a different type of conceptual diagram. So for example, if we said that this was our ecosystem, we could say that there are different factors that are impacting that ecosystem. So climate, organisms, relief, parent material, and then I'll put this arrow in for time. So in a sense that they're all affecting the ecosystem, there's no feedbacks that we're really worried about at this point. But that would be a conceptual diagram that we might use to think about the relative influences. And for example, if we were trying to take a look at one factor, we would try and hold all the others constant. And if we had a climosequence, we might only worry about climate. So that's a pretty simple way to draw it. And this is some of Terry's work when he's really worked hard on trying to understand the state factor approach for ecosystems. And this is part of a diagram that you'll see in its book, where he's tried to represent the state factor approach as it applies to ecosystems. And so you can see here's climate, that's one of them. What we had as relief is here's topography, parent materials here. Potential biota is the organisms. So it's not necessarily the organisms that are in place in an ecosystem, but the organisms that are likely to have the potential to be there, and that's the potential biota. Human activities, we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but let's ignore that for now. And then time is here, and what he really did was break time up into 2 parts. There's time since the last disturbance, and that's called succession. It's the relatively orderly replacement of species and the change in ecosystem processes. But also there's a much longer component too, which is ecosystem development. And so that time aspect, when we're thinking about ecosystems, part of that is we're thinking on relatively short time scales, maybe 100 years quite often, when the vegetation is changing and there are other properties that are changing. But also we want to keep in mind that time represents even longer periods, more so that Jenny was thinking about, of ecosystem development, of soils being changed over time, slowly and slowly. And then within that they have disturbance too, and then relatively light disturbances, we'll talk about this more later, put you on a successional pathway, and larger disturbances could reset ecosystem development even more. But this was how the book uses the state factors and tries to conceptualize them. In a little bit we're going to put some stuff in the middle here to think about some other controls, but for now that's their adaptation, for example, of the state factors, Jenny's state factors as it applies to ecosystems. Now, one thing I had done, and you probably will not find this anywhere else, is that I always felt that the state factor approach really needs to be modified slightly to take into account atmospheric resources. So we know that things like CO2 concentrations are important for how an ecosystem functions. We know that the atmosphere is going to deposit dust, it's going to deposit nitrogen. We'll talk about those things in future chapters. But really the state factor approach doesn't incorporate something like CO2 concentrations. And so at some point I had gone through and tried to revamp this a little bit to try and take into account resources as an independent state factor. And so there's pretty similar things here. You have climate, you have your regional species pool, that's your potential biota. You have time, which the authors had split up into 2 separate components of succession and ecosystem development. And then here I'm just going to lump parent material and topography into one and just talk about that as landscape factors, because quite often when we're working on ecosystems we're going to include an entire topographic sequence in there. So in that case we don't even think about it, we just average over it. But it's fine enough just for now to think about landscape. And then as another independent factor, there's resources. And these are independent more or less out of the control of what happens internally to the ecosystem, but it has a big effect on how that ecosystem functions. Now, it's possible we can redefine what climate is. We haven't defined it yet, but later on we could redefine what climate is to include CO2 concentrations. That's unlikely to happen, and so it's more important to probably say that there's another state factor we need to think about, and that's resources. That being said, I think it's important to know both sets, and really all three sets of state factor approaches. Know what Hans Jenny had originally said and understand CLORPT, climate, organisms, relief, parent material, and time, and then know the adaptation that Terry and the authors had taken here to adapt state factors to ecosystems. And with that, I would probably make sure it's important to know that resources can be deposited on ecosystems. They're really important and probably should be elevated to a state factor. So make sure you understand that resource supply, atmospherically derived resources, should also be a state factor.